Well, good evening once again. I'm very glad to be with you here at Grand Valley again. It is a lovely day out there, so it's really nice to enjoy this beautiful weather. Let's bow in prayer. Our Father, as we look at our subjects this evening of Galilee and the plain of Esdraelon, where Jesus spent so much of his ministry time and also of his life. And we pray that you'll help us to gain some further understanding about what things were like for him back then and people in the Old Testament and more modern times too. Thank you for the blessings you've given us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, here we go again, assuming I can make this work. I do want to review with a couple of slides. Thanks for the help of Neil. Last week, I was going blank when we were talking about, well, just how much water actually flows into the Dead Sea. I couldn't remember whether it was a 24-hour period or what, but I did remember that 6.5 million tons. Now, I can't imagine 6.5 million tons. That's such a huge number. But I did read at home in my book of Baker's Bible Atlas, written by Charles Pfeiffer, and I found on page 29 this quote. And that's exactly what he says. Now, to give you another perspective on that, a typical vehicle can weigh around 4,000 pounds. Is that not correct? Some of you that know vehicles a lot better than me. So a typical one's around 4,000 pounds. That's 2 tons. So divide this number in half. 6.5 million. And that's 3.25 million cars. The weight of 3.25 million cars in a 24-hour period going into the Dead Sea. Now that really brings it home to me. This is a huge amount of water that was going in there. And I told you the amazing thing was that the Lord set it up so that all of that evaporated at the rate to keep it at the same height, which to me only God can do something like that. The other thing is the temple of Artemis. Why, I wanted you to see a little better picture of her. So this was the temple that was in Ephesus. It also was in Gadara and some of the other cities, those Decapolis cities. Why, they worshiped Artemis as well. The Romans renamed that goddess Diana. And of course, they didn't like the looks of her, which I can understand that. So they made her into a very beautiful woman, shooting with a bow and arrow. And she was a hunter, and they had her doing different things. But whether you make her a real beautiful archer or whether she looks like this, why, it's hard for me to imagine that's what people were worshiping back then. But that again is exactly what they were doing. Now we want to look at the ministry of Jesus, and going back Old Testament times and then more recent times. There's just so much that has happened over the generations in Galilee. So take a look at some of these places. Whoop, hit the wrong button again. Get it back. Okay. So you see Nain right there. How do you think that widow felt? Lost her only son. And Jesus as they were in the funeral procession. Jesus changed her day for her, and changed her life for her. I'm sure she was grateful till the day she died, what Jesus did of raising her son back up. Of course, that happened at the small village of Nain. Then you look up here and you see Canaan. And you know about that. The very first miracle that Jesus did was there. His mother, pushed him and said, something needs to be done about this problem here. And that's in John chapter 2. I assume most of you know that story. I did actually read in Josephus today. He made the comment about Cana, and he said it was a village. So it was not one of these bigger places, we've seen with a big wall around it. It has been more like Grand Valley, with just a small village that Jesus went to this wedding. We see Ptolemais over here. This is Mount Carmel here. Mount Carmel is a fairly long mountain, and just up from it in that bay was Ptolemais. Ptolemais, that's the New Testament name for it. The Old Testament name was Akko, and the modern name for it is Acre. And so we'll be talking about that. As far as we know, Jesus never went there. Now, the Apostle Paul was there. We will be talking about Sepphoris. Sepphoris, in the time of Jesus, now that's very close to Nazareth, just maybe like 3.5 miles or something like that, from Nazareth. And that was the most well-fortified city, according to Josephus, in all of Galilee. And so there was a lot that happened there. Again, we'll talk more about these things. Then you look over here in Tiberias, so we'll be talking about that. And back over here, we're going to talk about Gadara again, and the Gadarene demoniac. So I hope you will keep looking at the maps, and that you'll be reading the material, that I've handed back out to you again, because I doubt that you can remember a bunch of this stuff, that I'm telling you. And if you can't remember it all, then lest you and I trade places. And so when you visit Nazareth, first of all, it has just changed so much from, I'm sure, what it was like for Jesus. But about the only place I remember on the tour where they showed us was, they showed us the home of Joseph and Mary. And they take you in this place right here, and they say, this is where Joseph and Mary lived. Well, how in the world did they know that? They definitely do not know that. But there's not much they can really show you in Nazareth that they can very directly connect it with Jesus. So, Nazareth, again, it's just 3.6 miles away from Sepphoris, the city we're going to be talking about more later. And here you see this church. This is the Church of the Annunciation. The Annunciation was what the angel Gabriel had to say to Mary when he said to her that you were going to bear a child. And of course, we can only imagine a little bit what kind of news that was for this young lady, to find out, that this was going to happen to her. She knew she was a virgin. And so you know about that. But this church here is commemorating, the Annunciation. And there's really not much else at Nazareth to see other than you can see it's a very modern city now. one thing Jesus could see every day, assuming he looked in that direction. If he looked out, going towards the east, he would see Mount Tabor. And Mount Tabor is about 1,600 feet above the plain. It's 1,850 feet above sea level, but when you're standing here on the plain, why, you're seeing this 1,600 feet. Now remember, this is like a 160-story building. So, you know, it's a fair ways up. And of course, all of these, the new part of Nazareth here and so forth that you see in front of it, and then you see all of the housing, you know, that's right there at the base of Mount Tabor. Of course, Jesus didn't see any of that. Mount Tabor, you can see this road that's going up to it. Again, when we were in Israel, they didn't take us up on top of it. I wish, you know, that they had taken us up, but I'm sure they would have taken us up this winding road, you know, to get up on top of it. The thing that I remember, of course, about that in the Old Testament was Barak. Barak and Deborah. Deborah was the only female judge in the Old Testament. Samson, of course, was one of those judges, and there were several of them. But she lived down in where the tribe of Ephraim was. So she's down in Samaria. But she got a message from God that she should go and find Barak, who he was from the tribe of Naphtali. So that's not too far. That tribe was right close to the Sea of Galilee. And so she was given the message, go to Naphtali, the tribe there, and find Barak and get him to get an army together and get up on top of Mount Tabor. So that's exactly what he did. He got 10,000 men. And they're up on top of this Mount Tabor, and in the meantime, the guy that they're facing, first of all, this whole area was conquered by Joshua. And the Israelites, you know, when they first went into, I call it the Holy Land, when they first went into the Holy Land, why, you know, they conquered this whole area. But now we're talking probably at least 400, maybe 500. I have to look up the dates here a little better, but we're talking at least 400 or more years later. And so at this point, the Canaanites, they have revived. And they've taken back a fair amount of this territory. And they have a king that's in Hatzor. Hatzor was just a little bit north of the Sea of Galilee. And so this King Jabin is living in that area, and he got his #1 military commander named Sisera, and he said, I want you to go down there and attack those Jews and go get them. And so Sisera got his 900 iron chariots and his army together, and he's down at the base of Mount Tabor. Now, of course, Barak is up on top of Mount Tabor, and you have to look down there and say, there's 900 chariots down there. Those chariots can move a whole lot faster than we can, and so forth. We're in big trouble. But Deborah again said to him, the Lord has told you, go down there and go get them. You're going to defeat them. And so you can read this in Judges 4, but that's exactly what they did. They went down to go get them. Now, here's another view of Mount Tabor that I wanted you to see. The other picture that you saw was if you were in Nazareth to the west. and you were looking back east at Mount Tabor. And of course, you saw all those modern cities. But this is looking at it from the east. And to me, this is more like what it might have looked like for Jesus. Because again, you wouldn't have seen, all of the modern housing and so forth that's there. This, of course, this is the plain of Esdraelon. The plain of Esdraelon was called the breadbasket of Israel. That's where they got their food. And they supplied food from this area for a bunch of other places. As I told you, it's a marvelous, very fertile area. Any farmer would love to, have that kind of place. Well, from this same area right here, back I needed to finish as to what happened. I assume most of you know what happened to Sisera. Sisera's army got caught, and they got badly beaten, and they ended up over by the Kishon River. The Kishon River is right by Mount Carmel, so where Acre, Ptolemais, is from, that's where the river, it goes down to the Mediterranean Sea. But it really shouldn't be called a river. It's a brook. And most of the time, you can just wade right across that thing real easy. But I'm surmising here as to how this might happen. Many times when we read Scripture, they don't tell us exactly how these things happen. Like, we have to try and figure out, how did it actually happen? And my guess is that when the army of King Jabin with Sisera was down there with their chariots, I think God sent some rain. And this was not a time for it to rain, but he sent some rain. And what happened to that whole area? Everything got muddy. And so what happened to the chariots? Especially when they got to the area of the river Kishon, it's one big muddy mess. And your chariot is of no use to you at this point. It's stuck in the mud. And at this point, that's when the Israelites, they are winning the day. Sisera actually had to abandon his chariot, and he took off and went across the river Kishon, and he ended up in a tent. The name of that woman that was there at the tent, her name was Jael. And of course, they knew each other. So Sisera said to him, of course, he is so tired he can't hardly walk. But he said to her, will you please hide me? So he said, get in the tent. So he got in the tent. He wanted some water. Well, she gave him some milk to drink, which is going to make him even more sleepy. And so he laid down in there. She covered him over. And he said to her, now you watch for me. And she promised, I will protect you. Well, if you know the story, you know how she protected him. She got a tent peg, and she got a hammer, and she went to his temple, and she drove that tent peg right through his temple and the key part of his head. And of course, a woman now won the day because she was the one, that killed him. And of course, if you remember Barak would not go down into this fight unless Deborah went with him. He said, I'll only go down and fight if you go with me. And she said to him, a woman is going to get the praise, for this whole battle. Well, it happened in both women, were very key in all of this. So, well, in this same area is Mount Gilboa. And remember, we talked about Mount Gilboa. That's right across the plate of Esdrelon is in between these two mountains, Mount Tabor and Mount Gilboa. Mount Gilboa and all of the other mountains all along on that side, they're all green most of the time of year. But Mount Gilboa is quite bare, as you can see on this one side. And I remember as we went through there, just looking at it, you can see it. It's very different. Why is it very different? David cursed it, remember. When Saul and especially Jonathan was put on there, that really touched David's heart. And David cursed that mountain. And today, why that's why it's still bare there today. Now back to Hatzor. Hatzor was where Jabin ruled from. This again is just north of the Sea of Galilee, and from here, why this is where Jabin's commander Sisera was sent. And so, going back, much earlier than this, why Joshua, of course, attacked this area, and he took this fortress. This was one of the best fortresses, in that whole area. It's not very high. It's only about 130 feet high. But it was a strong fortress. But it lost all of its power in the early centuries, and so I assume if Jesus would have gone there, why, he would have seen, just what we're seeing in this picture. It's just sort of a long fortress that has been left for many centuries, just by itself. Of course, you see the highway that's going right, modern highway that's going right by there. That was part of the way of the sea road that people would have taken, when they were going up north, like going to Damascus or anything, moving up north. Now let's look at this map again and zero in on some of these places. So, you see Dothan there. We'll be talking about that next week. You remember Joseph and his coat of many colors and showing up there, and things didn't go very well for him with his brothers. Well, that's in Samaria that we'll be looking at next week. Well, here's the way of the sea. Now notice it comes up and then it goes down like this, down by Beit Shan, and then it goes back up again. You'd have to cross the Yarmuk going that way, and again I have to go up down through that deep valley, on both sides of the Jordan Rift Valley there. And then you could start going on up further north. But there was another road that I think was probably even more common, was people would come through this way right here, and when they got right here, they would go between Mount Tabor and the hill of Morah. And they would go through there, and then they would stay on this side of the Jordan, or of the Sea of Galilee, and they would get up here, and just before you get to Lake Hula, there was the bridge of Jacob's daughters, and they would cross there. So these were the two routes, that people could take back in those days that were going up north. Now, the maps, the hand written ones that I have drawn for you, I didn't always get them, of course, in the right proportion. And even these professionals don't get things right all the time. You see Megiddo right here. Megiddo is, they have it on the north side of the road. But no, Megiddo should not be on the north side. It needs to drop it down, to be on the south side. So I'm going to show you some pictures of Megiddo. There's nothing to indicate that Jesus went to Megiddo, but this is such an important place because Megiddo, whenever people, armies or whatever was coming along the plain of Sharon, when they got up here, this Mount Carmel is quite long right here, but there is a pathway that you can go on, fairly narrow, going through there. And so then any of the armies going by or anybody traveling, they were going to go right by Megiddo. So it was a fortress that is watching over this main road, the way of the sea. It's called the Via Marius, another name. The Grand Trunk is another name for it. They had lots of different names many times for these things. So then we will come back and we will look at Akko. Now, Akko many times has an H in it. A-C-C-H-O is the way it's. This is the Old Testament name for that place. The New Testament name again was Ptolemais. Modern name for it was Acre. Actually, the guy that was the best man at my wife and I's wedding, his father grew up in Acre and came to the United States when he was about 19 or 20 years old. I can tell you some very interesting stories about him. He became the Presbyterian minister in the little town where I grew up. I just wish I was in their house, I don't know how many times. I just wished I'd had the sense back then to have him tell me a little bit more about, where he grew up and so forth. But he grew up in Palestine. And of course he was an Arab. But he became a Christian while he was studying at the University of Michigan. And of course it changed his whole life. And, so, here's Megiddo. Megiddo is not very high. It's only about 130, 120 feet or so above the plain. But as I told you, it overlooks that whole plain of Esdraelon and that road as the people were coming out of the narrow pass right there. So they could determine, do we go down and go attack those people, or do we just let them go, or whatever. But this place was guarding this main route. Now, the main thing in the scriptures that tells us about this was King Josiah. King Josiah, remember, he became a king when he was 8 years old. And so he had a marvelous high priest by the name of Hilkiah, who was a very godly man. And so his reign ended up being, a very godly reign. But he was the last of the good kings, because it's not going to be too long. He died actually in 609, and it wasn't too long after that before you get into the fall of Jerusalem in 586, and of course that's the end of the Jewish nation being there. But anyway, what did Josiah do? Josiah found out that the Egyptian king, who was Pharaoh Necho was going to go up to join the Assyrians in their battle with the Babylonians. The Babylonians had already defeated the Assyrians. The Assyrians' capital was Nineveh. Now you remember the story about Jonah and Nineveh. And of course, Jonah made it so that, well, God is behind this, but Jonah didn't want God to say that. Nineveh, he wasn't going to wipe it out, remember. But God, because the people in Nineveh, they got down on their knees and they asked God, for forgiveness. And so God gave them about another 150 years or so. But then the time came when they got defeated. And it was the Babylonians that defeated them. But that was in 612. But 3 years later, there's still some Assyrian force left. And they were going to have a battle again with the Babylonians. And when Pharaoh Necho found out about that, he decided he was going to go up and help the Assyrians, which they had been his bitter enemy for, the Egyptians' bitter enemy for a long time, were the Assyrians. So he's on his way with his army to go up. And Josiah got the idea, I'm going to stop him. And so he went up to Megiddo and he attempted to stop Pharaoh Necho, but he was killed at that point. That was not a good decision, on his part. But almost everything else that man did in his life, he made very good decisions. So here are the ruins that you can see present day Megiddo. Now, the archaeologists tell us that there are at least 20 superimposed cities here. So remember, when a city would get destroyed, as I told you, they would bring in the bulldozers, and the bulldozers would wipe the place out. Of course, the bulldozers, as you know, were just a bunch of people back then. How they moved all these stones around and so forth, I don't know. But they would level the place to the best of their ability. And then, of course, they used many of the stones and so forth to rebuild. But the archaeologists tell us that there are some 20 of these here. So archaeologists, they have a tough job, when they get into these places and they start trying to dig down and trying to figure out, just what was going on. Well, Solomon in his time, so David's time, just think about 1000 BC for David roughly. But Solomon, then, you've got to go on several years. So let's talk, say, around 930 or something like that. Why? Solomon, of course, he is a very strong king. He is very wealthy. He has 450 horses stored here at Megiddo. He has 150 chariots stored here. In general, the Israelites did not use chariots. Most of their territory was not chariot territory. Yes, the plain of Esdrelon and good weather and so forth, you can fly along in a chariot there. But a lot of the mountainous area, Israel, it's not suitable to chariots. One of the very interesting things at Megiddo was there's this long staircase, and it goes down 120 feet. Now again, visualize that as a 12-story building. When I think of 120 feet, where we used to live in Thornhill, our yard was 140 feet by 50 feet wide, which for that area was that was a good sized yard. For many places up here, where you'd say, that's not a very big yard at all. But 120 feet, when you're just walking in the yard and you're young, what's 120 feet? But when you put this up vertically, and you now have a 12-story building, this is another story. So this tunnel right here that you're seeing in the front part there, that tunnel, can you see the stairway there? So here's the stairway right here. And that stairway goes all the way down to the bottom. If you get there, go down that stairway. That's quite an exciting thing. Now, why did they go down this stairway? Because they've got a problem. the water generally is not up at the top of the hills. The water's in the lowest level. So that's where their water was. So they had to go down these steps. And when they got down to the bottom, then they had to go through a horizontal shaft that was 215 feet long, and then they got to the spring. Now that spring was out in the open. So is what they did, they had to cover that over so that people coming from the outside of that area, they didn't know that the spring was there. But that's how you would have to get your water back then. You'd have to go down those stairs, carrying your buckets down there, get the water, and back up. Now, of course, during the rainy season, they could have systems where they could catch some of the water and so forth. But again, remember this water situation. This is common at so many of these places, that you build your fortress up on the hill, but your water supply is down in the valley. And that's a huge problem right there. Of course, they had to have food. So here is a grain silo on Megiddo. So you can't quite see the bottom of it in this picture, but of course this doesn't go down 120 feet, out of this. I just have to throw a wild guess, maybe 15 feet or something like that. But it was a fair-sized grain silo. And if you read my notes, hopefully you remember that the three main products that Israel had was grapes and olives and grain. And of course they raised wheat and oats. So they would have wheat and barley. Wheat and barley were the two main ones. So, well, now I want to take you to north of Sepphoris. So you've got Nazareth, and then you go a little bit further north, and you have Sepphoris, which, as I told you, Josephus, who was very knowledgeable about in the first century about the military situation here in this area. Then you go another 7 miles, and you have this place, Jotapata. Jotapata was, first of all, I have to take you back to, in Alexandria, there were a lot of Jewish people living in Alexandria from the time Alexander the Great built that place. It was occupied by a lot of Jews in that area. But now we're talking, in the time of AD 67. And during that time, the Jews were being attacked in Alexandria. The Jews were being attacked in Syria. So the people in Israel, they're very upset about all this. And they're mad at the Romans because the Romans, weren't doing anything about this. So they rebelled against the Romans. And Josephus, he's 30 years old at this point. Josephus was named by the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, was named to be the general of Galilee. So they sent him up to Galilee to defend it. Now, why in the world he decided not to be in Sepphoris, which he himself says was the very best fortification, he went to Jotapata. Jotapata is not a real high hill here, but they have a strong wall all around it. And for 47 days, the Roman army under Vespasian, Nero was the emperor at that point, Nero sent Vespasian, and Vespasian had his son Titus with him. They're both going to enter into history big time. he sent them with 4 legions to go attack the Israelites. And so here is Josephus on top of this hill. He lasted for 47 days. Now they had no water on top of this hill. And this is in the fall of 67. So probably all the water that they had collected in their cisterns, the water is gone too. So they're having big problems here. Well, it ended up the Romans killed 40,000 people here at this little town. And I don't have time to go in to tell you how Josephus ended up being one of the sole survivors of this. But of course, when they got a hold of him, why, of course, he told them, he told Vespasian and the Romans, he said, I'm the general of Galilee. So, of course, they didn't kill him right away. They kept him with them, and as time went on, he ended up becoming a pretty good friend of Vespasian. And Vespasian's son Titus was 30 years old. Josephus is 30 years old. Josephus had visited Rome, so he's smart in many ways. But they ended up trusting Josephus, and Josephus ended up becoming their advisor as they're going to attack the rest of Israel. Well, one of the first things that Josephus did was he asked, after he got captured, he asked to have an interview with Vespasian. And Vespasian allowed that. And Vespasian, when they were having an interview, Josephus said to him, you are going to be the emperor. Now that's quite a prediction. Because remember, Nero is 31 years old at this point. And he's a very wicked guy and very powerful. He had a wife. His second wife was named Poppaea. When Josephus went to Rome, he personally met Poppaea and was at their house. And so Poppaea gave him some gifts, to take back with him. There's a long story behind all that. But the main thing I want you to understand with this is Nero, he got Poppaea's pregnant. And he got mad at her and being jealous, and so he kicked her to death. And then he ended up proclaiming her to be a goddess. Now, boy, I could tell you some stories about Nero. He was not a nice guy. But he's only 31 years old at this point, and he's the emperor. And so Josephus said to him, to Vespasian, you're going to be the emperor. Well, in the years, what covers 1 year period, taken going from 68 to 69, there were actually 4 Roman emperors. Otho, Vitellius, and Vesuvius was the other 3 guys. So this is a tremendous prediction for him to have made. Actually, then Vespasian ends up getting elected by his own soldiers while they're on the soil of Galilee, in the soil of Israel. They're actually close to Caesarea. The army there, they are fed up with what's happening in Rome. All these different emperors and all this stuff going on. They said, enough of that. They said, our emperor is Vespasian. At first Vespasian said, no, I don't want that job. But they said to him, you're going to take it. And so he took it. And of course, that meant that first of all, he had to go to Egypt to get things settled there in Egypt, to make sure, that everybody in Egypt understood, that he's the new emperor. And of course, all of this took time. Now, Titus and Josephus, they're in Egypt too at this point. Now, what did all this mean? It meant a pose in the war. Galilee had already been taken. Gadara had already been taken. There were a bunch of people killed in Gadara. Why do I mention that to you? Because I want you to remember the Gadarene demoniac. So this is about 35 years after Jesus healed the Gadarene demoniac. Was he still alive in Gadara at that point? Of course, I don't know. Josephus doesn't tell us anything about him. He just tells us what happened to Gadara. The place got wiped out. You remember what Jesus said to that Gadarene demoniac after he healed him? I'm sure he got dressed in some proper clothes, and he's now a very normal person. And remember, his request of Jesus was, I want to go with you. And Jesus said no. And here's something very different. Because remember, many times Jesus, when he healed somebody, he said to him, don't tell anybody. Now, many times we know that's not what they did. Why did he tell them, don't tell anybody? He knew the more popularity he had, the more trouble he was getting in Jerusalem. The more the leaders in Jerusalem were getting angry at Jesus. So many times Jesus had to keep things down to a low key as much as he could. But with the Gadarene demoniac, he said to him, you go and you tell people what I have done for you. And did he do that? I think for sure he did. Because remember, all the people in that area, of course, all the 2,000 swine had gone down into to their death down in the Sea of Galilee. The people of that time, they weren't going to grab Jesus by the throat, and say to him, get out of here. But they were saying to him, I think in as polite a way as they could, but in as firm a way as they could, they said, please leave our country and get out of here. And so Jesus left. Now, according to the Gospels, the only time that we know that Jesus was back in that area again was the feeding of the 4,000. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 had taken place on the Sea of Galilee up in the north part, over on the Transjordan side. But the feeding of the 4,000 was down somewhere in the area of the lower part of the Sea of Galilee. 4,000 men showed up with women and children. Why did they show up? I think to a fair extent because of the Gadarene demoniac. Because I think he did exactly what Jesus told him to do. Go and tell people about me. And he became a great evangelist for that area. So when Jesus came back again, he's not talking to 20 or 30 people. He's talking to 4,000 plus the women and children. And of course, he fed them too. But I think the Gadarene demoniac, now again, I'm surmising on all of that. But that's my guess. I'd like to talk to him when I get to heaven. I'd like to talk to the man born blind in John 9. I want to sit down and talk to him. And don't you want to talk to some of these people too? And say, tell us some more about what happened to you. I don't think I'm going to have much to say, going, well, what happened to me? I may say, well, I went to Grand Valley, But anyway, this Gadarene demoniac, I think he was a pretty marvelous individual. Well, how did they attack Jotapata? If you see this here, they've got a battering ram right here. So this battering ram, you see archers down here too. Of course, there's people up on the wall. They're attacking the northern wall, according to Josephus, because that was the weakest spot for Jotapata. And they've got this big battering ram, and those soldiers are pulling the thing back. And then they're letting it go. And of course, it didn't take them too long, to batter a hole in that wall. And once they got holes in the wall with the great firepower that they had and so forth. They did in Jotapata. This shows you a picture of one of the catapults. If you remember when we were talking about Alexander attacking Tyre. Now remember, that's about 400 years before this time. But they had catapults, we think back then, that would shoot 100 pounds the length of a soccer field, about 300 yards. So, but now the Romans, 400 years later, they have catapults that can fire rocks that are 160 pounds. They can fire it twice that far. They can fire it 500 to 600 yards. So again, that's like 5 soccer fields in length or so. So we'll talk about weapons a little more when we get to the fall of Jerusalem. So this again is just another picture of that. When they destroyed Jotapata and Gabara and so forth, one of the other places they destroyed was Tiberias. Tiberias, remember, was a fairly new city because it had been built by Herod Antipas. It had been built in AD 18 to 20. And so we're now into the fall of 67 and getting on into 68. It was during this time, that Galilee is being pounded by the Romans under Vespasian, and Tiberias was one of those places. It was completely wiped out too. Of course, this is the modern city of Tiberias that you're seeing. But I put this picture in there because you see the boats right there. The boats right there, why Vespasian had some of his soldiers jump in those boats, and because the people of Tiberias, many of them went out into the Sea of Galilee. Of course, they didn't jump into boats like that. But then the Romans had to go out into the Sea of Galilee and get them. But they got them. And they wiped that city out. Now, I put this picture in here to remind me of something else that happened here at Tiberias. Now, we know that by the time you get to the fall of AD 70, there's almost, aside from Messiah, and a couple other places, every place is wiped out in Israel. The Romans have completely destroyed, everything. Well, so many of the Jews were killed. Many of them ended up being slaves. They were, sold into slavery and so forth. But what happened after that? Well, there's a lot that we don't know. But we do know one thing for sure that happened at Tiberias. And this is AD 200. In AD 200, a guy by the name of Rabbi Jehuda, he wrote basically this book right here. Of course, he wrote it in Hebrew. This has been translated by this guy. There's over 800 pages in this. What is this book right here? This book is called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the written version of the oral laws. Remember, the Pharisees held to all these oral laws. The oral laws You probably know about the 2,000 cubits. You could only walk 2,000 cubits on the Sabbath day. Well, they had so many rules. If you had something in this hand and you threw it up in the air and you caught it with the same hand, that was work. If you wrote one letter, it was all right on the Sabbath. But if you wrote two, no, that was breaking the Sabbath. Now, I could go ahead and I don't have time right now to tell you a whole bunch of these other things. I just mentioned a couple other things. What would you do if your house is on fire on the Sabbath if you were living back then? Well, your house is on fire. You got this big jug of water right there that you could throw on it, and it's not a big fire, you could put it out. But it's on the Sabbath. You can't grab that jar and do that. So, according to these oral laws. And another one of them was, if a gazelle came into your house on the Sabbath through the front door, of course, you would be real excited. Boy, we're going to eat for several days very well here. If we could just get that door closed. If one person went over and closed the door, no, you have broken the Sabbath law. But if two of you went and closed the door, that's all right. Well, these laws, they are just crazy. And again, I could share so many of them with you. But of course, Jesus was he got into battle many times, with the Pharisees over these oral laws. Now, the thing you have to remember about these oral laws, if you broke one of those Sabbath days, you wrote two letters instead of you could only write one, what happened to you for that? You had to do a sin offering. What's a sin offering? A sin offering is a blood offering. You have to sacrifice an animal for this. This costs. Now, yes, there was provision in the Old Testament for poor people. They could substitute some fine flour or 2 turtle doves, for it. But when you broke the Sabbath, this was a costly thing for you. So Jesus went round and round with them over this. So, well, Mount Carmel was where Elijah contested the 450 prophets of Baal. I think most of you know the story about that, 1 Kings 18. Mount Carmel, it overlooks the plain of Esdraelon, depending on where you are, because it's a fairly long mountain. Depending on where you are, you can have a marvelous view of the plain of Esdraelon, or you can see the Mediterranean Sea, or you could be looking south, and see things, going down that direction. It's a marvelous viewpoint. It's green all the time on top of this mountain. I remember as a kid being shown pictures, of Elijah contesting with the 450 prophets. It was always on a very barren mountain, but that mountain isn't barren at all year round. It's very green. So it's 1,732 feet high, but where it meets the Mediterranean Sea, called the Great Sea, it's 500 feet high right there. So that's why the way of the sea did not stay, going in that direction. This geography, again, determined that. Well, now we're at Ptolemais, or modern Acre, Akko in Old Testament times. And so this again is some of the ruins, from back then. And of course, this is probably from medieval times. 1,100, 1,200, somewhere in that time, when this was built. more structures here, but you can't see any structures here, that would go back to the time of Christ. There is a very modern temple here that was built in the 18th century by Al-Zazar. He was called the Butcher. And so he built this beautiful mosque. And so if you would go there, you can see that mosque. This is the inside of a mosque. How many of you have been in a mosque? Okay, in a mosque, I've been in several, in Toronto, but only the men. You see how this is with sort of little patches there? Like they gather in worship with only the men. The women are there, but they're entirely in another place where they can't be seen. It's only the men and the boys. They would be in here. They do a lot of kneeling down, and again, you've probably seen some of this where they're down. But they're just one right after another, and so in their places of worship. Well, one more slide here. This is a view from Akko. It's about 10 miles away from Akko. You're again in this plain of Esdrila. It's just a very beautiful plain. But then you see the hills of Galilee. The further you go on into Galilee, the more harsh the environment gets. So that's why in Upper Galilee, there were some people, of course, that lived there. But you don't have any in major cities that were there. All the major cities were down in Lower Galilee. That's why Nazareth and so forth was down there. So next week, we're going to get into Samaria, and we're going to look again a little bit at Transjordan. So, Lord willing, I'm going to look forward to being with you next week, dealing with those topics.
I do know that sometime you may have a question about something that I